Well, bonsoir. Bonsoir tout le monde. Bonsoir, mesdames, messieurs. Good evening. It's really nice to have a chance to do a bit of research. It's been so boring, lockdown. And actually, it's because of lockdown that I ended up litter picking, which Liz knows all about, and taking long walks to Headley. And on one of my long walks to Headley, I zoomed off to the church. It's quite a nice little church. And of course, you're not allowed in the church because they're rebuilding bits of it. But I started wandering around the churchyard. And in my wanders, I came across a tomb to a certain Thomas Ripper. No relative of Jack Ripper, just Thomas Ripper. And Thomas Ripper was coachman to a certain Roger Cunliffe for up to 50 years. And Roger Cunliffe lived at Tyrrell's Wood. And I thought to myself, Cunliffe? Cunliffe, that's an unusual name. Well, actually, it's a very interesting name because I know quite a lot about a certain Alan Percy Cunliffe. And so I zoomed off to my friend Elaine, who is fantastic and does lots of fantastic research. And I said to her, Elaine, can you track down the Cunliffes? And I also asked Diana. And Diana was able to tell me that the Cunliffes come from Lancashire. They were mill owners. Lots of money there. Loads of money. So Elaine came back with the astonishing information, which had honestly never crossed my mind, was that Headley Court was rebuilt and owned by a certain Walter Cunliffe, the first Baron Cunliffe, who was the governor of the Bank of England. Oh, I thought that's really interesting because the 1913 Derby was won by a Boyer in the end, and a Boyer was owned by a certain Alan Percy Cunliffe. Here we start the story of Druid's Lodge. And this story of mine goes all over the place. It does go to Shanty. Absolutely, it goes to Shanty. So this, guys, is Druid's Lodge stables, because in 1990, there was a chap who wrote a book called Druid's Lodge Confederacy. His name was Paul Mathieu. I was working for Mr. Allen at the time, and I decided that I could not resist going down to Druid's Lodge on Salisbury Plain and taking some photographs. So off I went. It was a rainy day. Looks like it was sort of spring. Obviously, I take no notice of the weather. And I went zooming down there, and I met the lady whose name I've completely forgotten, who was using Druid's Lodge and using the stables there. And what astonished me was the quality of the workmanship. All the stable doors were made of solid oak, absolutely solid oak. We can go on to the next slide, I think. There you go. This is outside the stable. She is arriving with one of her horses. So this is the outside of the stable yard. I'm not sure if that is the house. I don't think that's the house that Alan Percy Cunliffe built, because I think he built a huge house, which at some later date was demolished. I think that was just the house for the stable staff. So this is outside the stable yard. Oh, well, you know. And the next slide. Now, this is one of the stables. Now, this may not mean anything to you because you guys don't live in stables like I do, but that's a marble. Well, it's a porcelain manger. Bloody nicely made, beautifully made. The stable walls were fantastic. The floor is tiled. My goodness, you couldn't fault that stable. There was a skylight here, beautiful, heavy oak doors. I mean, quality stuff, quality stuff. It turns out that Alan Percy Cunliffe, who was the brother of Walter Cunliffe, who owned Headley Court, was equally wealthy. And he owned a large swathe of Salisbury Plain. And he went to Harrow, whereas his brother, Walter, went to Eton. It's probably why he became the governor of the Bank of England, because I think probably if you become governor of the Bank of England, you've got to have gone to Eton. Anyway, so Alan Percy Cunliffe goes to Harrow. At Harrow, he met a bloke by the name of Wilfrid Purefoy. Now, Wilfrid Purefoy was always nicknamed Pure. Wilfrid Purefoy inherited a huge amount of money from a chap called the Duke of Cleveland. who I think he was his uncle. So he inherited a fortune. And Purefoy and Cunliffe met in South Africa sometime later. I don't know whether it was Boer War stuff or whatever, but they met. And they must have talked a lot about horses. Maybe they talked a lot about horses when they were at school together. They probably did. They probably ran betting rings. I wouldn't be at all surprised if Alan Percy Cunliffe ran betting rings at Harrow School. So they got together and they thought, this would be interesting. We've got a lot of money. Why don't we ruin the bookies? We'll ruin them. We'll absolutely ruin them. Let's set up our own stables. We'll do everything really, really well. We'll employ the best people possible. And they certainly did. They had a chap called Edward Wigan, who was a genius horseman. They had Holmer Purd, who was an Irish vet. Unbelievable chap. Their trainer was a bloke called Jack Fallon. Not at the time when Boyer won the Derby, but prior to that. And they also had a chap called Frank Forrester. And Frank Forrester was a brilliant, brilliant horseman and sportsman. And between these guys, they knew horses. They really knew horses. So Holmer Purd would go over to Ireland and buy horses. And they got the best lads they could possibly get. And I haven't photographed their, I don't think I put a photograph in of the toilets and the bathrooms, but I did photograph the toilets and the bathrooms, and also the dormitories that these lads lived in. And so they got all these lads together. They built this incredible stables on Salisbury Plain, and then they rubbed their hands together to see what they could get in the way of dodgy horses who were actually very good and who could be put on the track and win them large quantities of money at fantastic prices, 100 to 8, 30 to 1, 60 to 1, And they also set up a betting organisation whereby they could get bets put on all over the world. Well, of course, in those days, it was all telegraph. So if a bet was put on before 12 o'clock, it had to be acceptable. But it might take an hour to get to where it had to arrive to. So they had people all over England, and in fact, in South Africa and in some other odd places, who betted for them. They set off with some very good horses, and Heckler's Pride was one of their best. She won a huge amount of money for them. And when we're talking winning money, we're talking the equivalent of millions today. Millions. They also had a very good jockey called Bernard Dillon. And he was a young lad, came to Druid's Lodge, showed quite a lot of style, determination, whatever, and was duly taken on and turned into a jockey. He was only a lad when he got there. Just to put a little bit of colour into this, there was a chap called Robert Sevier, and Robert Sevier owned a horse called Scepter. And Scepter was probably one of the best mares to run anywhere, next to Blink Bonnie, who was also another fantastic mare. And I discovered when I was up in York, here I go, off at a little tangent, that Blink Bonnie's bones had recently been thrown over the wall behind the museum and left to rot. I was absolutely heartbroken. My friend Dee Dee told me that. So Blink Bonnie was another fantastic race mare who won huge amounts of money. Then there was Scepter. Now she won the 1,000 and the 2,000 guineas and was second in the Derby. She was some shit hot mare. I mean, this mare could gallop, yeah? And she was trained down in Wiltshire, just off the A303. And I have actually galloped on the same gallops that Scepter was trained on. That's another bit of an aside. Anyway, so with Druid's Lodge set up and now starting to earn serious money and starting to give the Jockey Club, of whom one or two of them were, I think one of them was a member, I think Purefoy was a member of the Jockey Club. However, they were stewards. Cunliffe was a steward at Sandown, and he also had shares in Sandown. So they all had their little fingers in all the pies around. They were stewards at Brighton and Sandown. They owned shares in the racecourses. These were serious businessmen. They were not fooling around. So when it came to 1913, Druid's Lodge had accumulated large quantities of money, and the Jockey Club was seriously upset by their extreme success. And remember, these chaps weren't poor. They were extremely wealthy. And so what we had was a rather interesting situation in which there were two horses put in for the, no, not the only two, but two of the horses that were entered for the Derby in 1913 were both by Desmond, the sire Desmond. One was a Boyer, and a Boyer was a horse that they bought in. He was a bit of a stayer, but he wasn't a very nice horse. He had a bit of a temper, and actually the stable lads didn't like him very much. I don't think he liked the stable lads very much. And one day when one of his stable lads fell off him, he galloped all the way from the Salisbury gallops into Salisbury town itself. And somebody very kindly caught him and put him in a stable, and they had to go and collect him the next day. So he did 6 miles at a flat out, pretty much at a flat out gallop, and ended up in the middle of Salisbury. Hilarious. So we knew he could stay. Anyway, a Boyer missed a couple of good outings, won the Cambridgeshire, won a few decent races, but he wasn't anywhere on the class of Craigenor. Now, Craigenor was also by Desmond, and he was a much classier horse, much better horse. But Craigenor also has a rather dodgy history, quite an interesting history, actually. There was a chap called Eustace Loader. Now, Eustace Loader was a member of the Jockey Club, terribly wealthy, frightfully upper class, considered himself to be quite the man about town, but socially at the top of the ladder. And Eustace Loader bred Craigenor. That was he bred it. And he sold it to the Sledmere Stud, and the Sledmere Stud sold it to a chap called Bauer Ishmay. Now, Bauer Ishmay was involved in the White Star Line. Oh, we all know about the White Star Line, don't we? Mm. Yes, Titanic. Yep. When was Titanic? 12, wasn't it? Yeah, 1912. Yeah. So the white, he was mixed up in the White Star Line, either owned it or was part owner or whatever. And he had bought Craigenor. Now, he also apparently had a bit of an affair with Eustace Loader's sister-in-law. Bit of an affair. One doesn't know whether he was trying to climb up the social ladder or whether he really was passionately in love with her or whether he was just trying to be irritating. However, Eustace Loader developed a distinct dislike of this man. Dislike in many ways. Not only because he messed up his sister-in-law, not only because he was rather sort of lower class, but also because he bought Craigenor. Now, Craigenor won some damn good races. He won the 2,000 guineas. And he was a pretty class horse. He when it came to the Derby, Craigenor was definitely favourite, obviously going to win the Derby. And he was going to be ridden by a jockey, an American jockey by the name of Reef. And Johnny Reef had come over from America and was doing extremely well in both France and England. He'd won the Derby in 1907. He won it again the year before, 1912. He won it, and he was quite he was a very crooked jockey, actually. He got hauled up by the Jockey Club on several occasions. He then took the Jockey Club to court for taking his license away. Oh, couldn't make it up, really. He was he had a very baby face, but he was no innocent angel, I can assure you. And he did end up, on the same year in 1913, he won the Prix de Jockey Club and the Prix de Diane in Chantilly. So he's definitely a great connection to Chantilly. And he was a very tough jockey. Now, we had Frank Wootton riding in the race. We all know about Wootton. He was Epsom trained and bred, but came from Australia. A bit like Scobie Breesley. So many of them come from Australia. Anyway, the Wootons. So we had quite a collection of extremely good horses in this race. But then there was another element to this race, which was altogether extraordinary, and that was the suffragette movement. Of course, you all know about Emily Wilding Davidson. Everybody knows about her. Gosh, her plaque is even on the Tattenham corner. Here we go, Emily. Hello, Emily. Very clever woman, had 2 degrees. And of course, in those days, you could get as many degrees as you wanted as a woman, and you would never be given them. You could take them, you could get your degree, but you could never use it. And women were not allowed to have degrees. Emily Wilding Davidson by 1913, I think had been in prison about 9 times, something like 9 times, don't quote me, but it was something like that. And she'd been on hunger strikes, I think about 3, and she'd been force-fed, and she did manage to get out of prison on that. And I think at one time she jumped over the barrier in the prison and threw herself onto the floor, but she was caught by the wire netting. She was an extremely, what can one say, conscientious but rather enthusiastic suffragette. There were suffragists as well as suffragettes, and they were peaceful and they did things quite differently. But the suffragettes were pretty. They were pretty inflammatory. They did a lot of crazy things. They set fire to post boxes, and she did throw something at someone she thought was the Prime Minister, but it wasn't. It was a mistaken identity. So on this particular day, she had gone to the Derby and she had got a return ticket. And it's fairly clear to a lot of people that if you're going to commit suicide at the Derby, you don't get a return ticket. It's a bit more expensive, isn't it, to come back? So they did find a return ticket in her pocket. And she was just placed herself on the rails at Tattenham Corner. And if you go and look at the race over and over again, you can see that there are several versions of what she did, but the main field had actually passed her. So we're going to go to the 1913 Derby. That's actually Cregganore, and that was sold to me as a picture of a Boyer. So there you go. Everybody gets things wrong. We're going to go to the 1913 Derby now. Very exciting. And I'm just going to run you through the race because it was exciting. All the horses were lined up at the takes. Yes, they're all lined up and they're off to a good jump start. Cregganore and Johnny Reef get away really quickly, but it looks like he's had to take a little bit of a pull and he's allowed a Boyer to take up the lead. This outsider is now holding on to the lead. Everybody can't believe it. Alan Gord is touching him already, and then Cregganore is staying on in contention. They're running up the hill and they get to the top of the hill and start to go round Tattenham Corner. And this is where things start to go a little bit wrong. The leading horses, of which the leading horses were Nimbus, Great Sport, Cregganore, Aboyer, Day Comet was in there. Bachelor's Wedding was a little bit far behind with Steve Donahue on, and Shogun, and Sunyat was there too. And as they come past Tattenham Corner at a speed that Emily Davidson would not have ever understood, she stepped out in front of Amma, the King's horse. And she appears to have done something, no one's quite sure what, but the horse plows into her. She's down, the jockey's off, the horse is down. And as you can see in the film, as soon as this happens, the crowds just come onto the course and surge over. But hey, let's go back to the race itself. These guys in front don't even know this has happened. They haven't got a clue. They're running forwards and they're going flat out. But they are having a bit of what I can only describe as a battle. It was described afterwards by one or two of them as a bullfight. Wootton tries to come in on his horse and he hits a Boyer. A Boyer then, because he wants to come in on the rails, a Boyer then cuts off Shogun and Day Comet. Wootton tries again to come through because he likes being on the rail, Frank Wootton does. He tries yet again to come through, but he fails, and a Boyer is now shutting him off completely. So a Boyer, Cregganore and Shogun and Nimbus are all basically bumping into each other like a whole load of pins in a bloody ball game. So they come down towards the finish and they're practically in a line. We can go to the next slide, I think, because I think it's the end of that's it. They're practically in line. Can you see them here? Yeah, they're practically in a line. There's hardly anything between them. But Cregganore, you can see that heart He's got his nose in front. So he is declared the winner. They bring him in, we don't need to go back to where a boyer is being brought in, because it was sold to me, where Creganor is being brought in, which was sold to me as a boyer. But Creganor was declared the winner of the race and was brought in to the winner's enclosure. Now, Percy Cunliffe and Pure had been trickling money onto this 100 to 1 aboyer for months. Oh, that's the jockey. His jockey was Edwin Piper. They've been trickling money onto this horse for a long time. Little bits of money. £250 here, £250 there, £10 there, £40 there, £1,000 there. A lot of money. And 2 days before the race, the jockey, Lewis, the trainer, Lewis, discovers that a boyer is lame. Takes him out for a gallop, brings him back, and he's lame. They are about to pull him out of the race. But Lewis looks at him a couple of hours later, takes him out for a trot. Nothing wrong with him. Okay, he's going to London. Just get him up to the Derby. Put him on a train and get him up to the station. Everything went by train in those days. So something was about to be called off. The horse gets up and runs in the race. Now, Eustace Loder, Lord Wolverton, and the other steward was dear Lord Rosebery from the Durdens. Lord Rosebery had a runner in the next race. Lord Wolverton wasn't terribly interested. The jockeys didn't dare to complain because they'd all bumped each other. They'd all ridden a rough race. They'd all had a go. Frank Wotton, Johnny Reef, Edwin Piper, the lot of them. They were all guilty of malpractice. And so nobody wanted to say anything. But Eustace Loder did not want his horse, Creganor, to win the Derby because he hated Bauer Ishmael. Disliked him intensely. So he waited for a bit, he looked around, they started to pay out on Creganor, and suddenly Eustace Loder called a steward's inquiry, had Creganor taken out because of his bumping, and a boyer was declared the winner of the Derby. There he is. You couldn't have made it up. Can you imagine the row, the crowds, the shrieking, the hallooing? You've taken a favourite out and you've said it's won, and then you've declared that it hasn't won, and you've put in 100 to 1 winner. And the only person who's going to gain from this 101 winner is probably one of the biggest criminals in racing, whose brother runs the Bank of England. He wasn't really a criminal, he was just a clever man who just liked pulling horses. So Percy Cunliffe and Purefoy must have made a bomb that day. I should think they went home with their pockets up to £1 million. God knows. We'll never quite know, because no one's ever going to tell us. But I would have loved to have been in Headley Court that night. I would have loved to have sat at the dinner table with Walter Cunliffe and his delightful wife and discussed his brother, who had just, through no fault of his own, Eustace Loder's fault actually, won an extraordinary derby at 100 to 1. And I bet that was all they talked about all night. And I'm sure if you went into the dining room at Headley Court and you put your ear to the wall, you could probably pick up the vibrations. There was another thing, not quite the end. There was another thing. Thanks to Liz and everybody else, we've done rather a lot of litter picking. And I was out litter picking. And I met a lady who was with a gentleman who looked of Indian origin or something. He was tall, handsome chap. And she was a very nice lady. And she came over and talked to myself and Nigel Wybrow, who is he looks after the race course. And Dave was up there, I think, who looks after the horses coming over. He's a downskeeper. And she said, it's so nice to be here. She said, it's so lovely. I do love Epsom Downs. And I sort of looked at her and said, oh, how nice. Yes, Epsom Downs, wonderful. And she said, well, I sort of had connections here. And I said, oh, well, how delightful. You have connections in Epsom. Do tell me. And she said, Emily Wilding Davidson is my great aunt. The lady's name is Barbara. And I have suggested to Barbara that as soon as Bourne Hall opens, she goes and sees Jeremy Hart, because he has got the book that was filled in by the policeman, which describes her state and how they found her. And that is in the Bourne Hall Museum. And I said, you really should go and have a look at it, because it would be very interesting for you. Go and talk to Jeremy. Jeremy knows everything. I'm just a beginner. So she said to me, I'll tell you something. She said, very interesting. It's been handed down the family as a bit of a sort of silly story that Emily had gone out to a field of ponies a few days before the Derby, and she'd taken one of her long suffragette scarves, and she'd been practicing throwing this scarf over the necks of the ponies. And that is, of course, what she tried to do. And they did find the scarf on the course. The scarf was found on the course by one of the clerks of the course, and then it was much later, it was sold at auction after he died. So she was able to fill in the last bit of that incredible story. And as I said, her name was Barbara. She's still around. I saw her again the other day. So all I can tell you is the Boyer got bought by the Russians for about £10,000 and probably ended up in the Russian Revolution. So I don't think he lasted very long. Creganor was sold to Argentina for £30,000, a much better horse, and he lived a lot longer and probably had a much more successful time. So poor old Aboye, the other son of Desmond, disappeared into the Russian Revolution. And Johnny Reef, he went back, and he went back to France. He rode in Chantilly. He had already won the Prix de Jockey Club and the Prix de Diane that year. He was a very, very good jockey, and he eventually goes back to America, where he dies. Edwin Piper, thank you. Little Edwin Piper is buried in Ashley Road. He came and lived in Epsom. He spent the rest of his life here, and he called his house a Boyer. And he's buried in Ashley Road Cemetery. And Ian, my friend Ian Parker, kindly sent me the number of his grave. And because I'm lazy, I haven't been down there to find it and take a photograph of it, but I promise I will. That'll be my next thing. I will pop down and get a photograph of the grave. So the Druids Lodge Confederacy slowed down. They stopped buying horses. Alan Percy Cunliffe got married, quite extraordinary, really. He was a jovial sort of fellow, large and jovial and sort of awfully happy, and always wore a bowler hat. But he did get married, actually, and the Druids Lodge Confederacy sort of broke up, and that was the end of that. But that is my amusing all-round sort of, oh my goodness, we are all connected. Headley Court, Barbara on the Downs, Druids Lodge Confederacy, and my life with Mr. Allen, and bumping into Paul Mathieu, who wrote the book, and also this extraordinary story that connects all of us. So thank you very much.